Transferring wealth successfully starts with asking yourself questions that will give your family a better life now and for generations to come. In this podcast, financial professionals John and Michael from Copper Beech Financial Group guide you through eye-opening questions to help you discover the truth about your wealth. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to The Truth About Wealth with John and Michael Parise of Copper Beech Financial Group. John, what's going on?
Same old stuff, Eric. All good. Just got back from a little trip to Florida to visit a sick friend. Michael was off to a conference. So we're kind of circling the wagons today and jumping into a podcast right off the shoot. So
yeah, well, welcome back. Welcome back. And Michael, I know that you're going to introduce the guest today.
I am. Yes. I'm happy to have Joe Mechlinski on the podcast. Joe, how are you?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Joe. Nice to hear you again.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, this is going to be great. So Joe, I'll obviously let you give a little bit of your history and your background, which is an awesome one, which is why you're here today. But Joe is the CEO of Shift, which is a tech-enabled management and consulting firm that's been nationally recognized as one of the 9 times best places to work, which is an amazing feat. So I'm very interested to hear about that. But you're also a New York Times bestselling author. You're a TED Talk presenter. So we've got a great guest, I think, with us today.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much again.
Thanks, Joe, for coming.
Well, let's not call it too early. Let's see how the content.
You're going to be just fine.
Yeah. So why don't you give us a little bit of your backgrounds and what you do as a company and what you have done, and let's kick it off here.
Awesome. Well, I can assure you this, that most management consultants don't have this background that I do because, I started my whole career basically in the streets of Baltimore. So I am originally from Baltimore, born and raised on the east side, as they say, and, really started hustling at the age of 13, mostly out of the need to just eat. I grew up in a real poor environment and, had a pretty tough childhood and, found myself in high school at literally the worst high school in the state of Maryland. We had a 23% graduation rate, which means we started off with 965 freshmen and graduated 235 seniors 4 years later. We had the number 1 football team in the state. My quarterback got shot. I mean, you just check all the boxes of all the stereotypes. But, I also happen to be very fortunate. My dad is like my hero. He is the most humble, hardworking, just really heart-centered leader I've ever met in my life. He lives his life with honor. He's been at the same company for 46 years, guys.
Wow.
And, he just happened to, it is an anomaly. He, started off like the American dream, sweeping floors, and now he's like an executive in a 4,000 person company. But the guy that he happened to work for happened to be an All-American lacrosse player and football player at the Johns Hopkins University, which is really where my story starts. I was able to go from that environment in Baltimore to this, extremely competitive academic institution. And it was sort of my first big quantum leap of like, okay, I basically just figured out how to read a book and write a paper. And now I'm going to be in the deep end with some really smart people. And while I was there, I just figured out that I was not going to be an engineer. I was not going to be a doctor. I was not cut out for Wall Street. I was cut out for business and being a small business owner and an entrepreneur back before that word even existed. And so I started a couple small businesses in the late 90s. One of them went from 5 to 150 people in about 3 years. And I just got the bug. I mean, I'm sure there are people listening to this that can remember the time when they found out like the one thing they thought they were really good at. And I've had that happen in sports a few times with football and lacrosse. But with business, it just sort of clicked. And I learned about this thing called management consulting while all this was happening and nearly took a job with one of the big 4 back then, but ended up wanting to start this business that I still have today. So we've been at this for 22 years. We work with about 600 plus companies. And just going back to my dad for a quick second, I mean, while I was at Hopkins, I thought I'd gotten the lottery ticket. Like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be around a really smart people with a lot of money. They got to be happy. And when I got there, I was like really shocked that that was not the case. That apparently, being a poor kid, I thought money would make you happy and certainly gives you freedom and flexibility. But a lot of those kids were overly stressed, overly burned out, not living a life of their own. And so for me, I sort of started thinking about, when you look at the workforce, just the idea that we spend 8 to 10 hours a day doing this thing that most Americans just don't like. If we think that people not liking things or not loving them deeply is going to bring out their best or unlock discretionary effort or get people to go from like having to do things to getting to do things to even wanting to do things, we're going to have to change things up. And so what we've done, quickly here is we've just found a way to work with executives to help not only clarify where they're going, but also to how to think about resourcing and getting their people to be sort of fired up, suited up, and ready to go for the week. And it's been really, really, really fun because not only have we been able to boast about some of our client successes, but we've also watched them actually do the thing that we know needs to be done for people, which is just treat them like adults, treat them like humans, treat them like people that you would treat in any other business or any other setting, just not business.
Simple, right?
Yeah, supposedly, John. So that's really what we've been up to, and it's been a wild ride. I've had a chance to work with a lot of really exciting companies earlier in my career. I even helped a couple companies as they IPO'd. And then as I wrote a book back in 2012 that did really well. And then was another quantum leap moment for me. We went from working with just exclusively small to mid-sized businesses to like the CEO of Benjamin Moore called me and John Hancock and New Balance and some really big organizations to help them do the thing that we were doing for small to mid-sized companies. So there's been a lot of other twists and turns, but I think, just for me, it takes a lot for me to say this, but I'm really proud of the work that we do. I'm really proud of the way that we help. I think ultimately the mission is how do you change the way people work so it literally transforms the way they live?
Hey, Joe, real quick, I'm going to interrupt you here for a second. Let's go back to your dad, because we're all special to our kids. Right, Michael?
Oh, here we go. This is where I'm going to be forced to also say that my father is my hero.
Well, I was paid to say that, Mike.
I hope that's a little late on that draw, would you say? Yeah. Right? What do you think, guys? Anyway, all seriousness. I mean, when you look at your dad, we always work with families. We always try to share values and transfer those values, hopefully, to the next generation. If you go back to your relationship with your dad, what values did you take from him that helped you not only your career but drive your entrepreneurial side of you and be successful? What can you say about your dad and even your mom too, by the way?
Yeah, well, I mean, look,
not leaving mom out.
No. Listen, I'll give that story here in a second, but just focusing on my dad, I ended my first book, Grow Regardless, with exactly this answer, John, which was, humility is where it starts. My dad is this guy who does not care about the credit. He is, got just this very humble approach to life. And I can't possibly explain that more. When you meet him, the people that work with him or know him, just know that, he's the kind of the person that you can set your clock by. So it's not just, humility, it's also dependability. I mean, he is the most consistent human being I've ever met. You literally can set your watch by him. And beyond that, he's a hard worker, blue collar guy from Baltimore City. My life pales in comparison, or I should say his pales in comparison to mine. I mean, I've got a hard story. His is 10 times harder. And he broke the cycle. He found a way to show up 46, 47 years now. That's
wonderful.
Day.
That's a wonderful story.
And I'll say one last thing about him, which is, I think really important, is that the guy leads with honor. And so to me, honor is everything from just keeping your word. Honor is, back to being humble and not taking the spotlight. And honor is just taking the high road always, even when it's really hard. And he's mastered that skill better than anyone I've ever met.
Fabulous.
Just to follow up on that, because that's an amazing story, Joe, but how, I'm assuming, without having seen your consulting work firsthand with a company, but I would assume that story is a core part of your message today with businesses. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would assume that that's the case. Am I correct in that?
For sure. I mean, look, I often tell my dad, I was just with him this past weekend, and I was like, just to be clear, Dad, Shift is still basically a personification of who you are and who you be and how you show up. And, a good portion of how we approach leaders, is got a lot of resonance or connection points to how my dad would, just remind me little things like everybody puts their pants on every single day, just like everybody else does. And, none of us are as smart as all of us. And just little Jim Mechlinski-isms that I have been able to, frankly, carry forth and sort of transfer from, my relationship with him and the way that he shows up to, really putting out things that I think it's like when you hear these things, it's not like he made them up or I get the chance to like, these are not my ideas. But I do think when you make the invisible visible, meaning like when you hear these things, you go, oh yeah, I probably could do a little more of those things. Or they're just reminders of things that we all know that are true. That to me is a good mark of whether these are things that folks could, if invited, to try them on and see if they work, because none of us are perfect. But at
Joe,
the same time, we can all get better.
Yeah. And why I also ask that question is I go back to when I grew up. You were fortunate. I grew up without a father. So when I had Michael, I go, what do I do with this kid? I had no roadmap or no parent that I could go to and say, listen, how do I do this type of thing? So I was fortunate. I had a strong mom that kind of raised us, but I didn't have a father. So I was curious on what you got from your dad,
right,
from a value standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, look, he's definitely, as I said, he's done a really nice job. And John, as you and I talked about, look, I think in a lot of ways, we're just all doing our very best to figure out this moment by moment. If we're being really honest, we're all making this up as we go along.
Absolutely.
And so
I couldn't agree with you more from our conversation. That's what I took from you. Everybody's just doing it the way it has to go, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Joe, one thing I wanted to touch on is sort of what you see in the executive marketplace these days. We're obviously, hopefully, out of the pandemic situation. Work is shifting, attitudes are shifting, economy is shifting. What are the key concerns that you're seeing from the executives that you work with, or the struggles that they're having, and how are you guys addressing that to them?
Well, look, I think there's been enough said about the last 2+ years of just trauma that everyone's gone through, right? So everything from, a health pandemic to all of the things that we brought into the pandemic, right? Like, the social justice issues, the economy, the way in which we're all just showing up for each other in general in the community. And I think if you now parlay that to where we stand today, I think the headline for me, after, certainly working with lots of executives, is the pain of change. Meaning the world is moving at about 180 miles an hour, on a good day. Maybe it even moves faster than that. But most organizations, before the pandemic would have been happy at 60 to 90 miles an hour. The problem is that gap of how quickly things are emerging. Just as an example, most people have probably heard of ChatGPT and AI. This is a platform that is the fastest growing platform on the planet, 100 million users in less than 6 months. Wow. We're not contemplating this because we're sort of the frog in the water as it's being turned on, ever so gently. But that compounding effect now sort of adds up quite a bit to, everything from robotics, advanced manufacturing, 3D printing, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, blockchain. All of these things are now converging in a way that businesses have to start really thinking about, how do I stay relevant? And I think a lot of leaders, if you double click one more layer underneath of this, is like, okay, so most organizations had some great resignation dynamic. Lots of folks are trying to get their folks to come back into the office, which I don't really have a hard opinion other than I think everybody should pick what's best for them, both the employees and also the employer. And right now, the sort of the levers at an executive's disposal are really two things. I can either force you to come to a meeting, or I can send out an email and hope that is that'll move the needle. And I will just tell you that, right now there's 252% more meetings that have been scheduled since the pandemic got going. And on the other end, no one's reading any emails. I saw a stat recently. You guys will probably be blown away by this, but can you imagine if you were an executive of a 1,000-person company and you send out an email to your team right now, the open rate of an email is around 50 to 70% in a company that size.
Wow.
Now, one more. Of the people that are actually reading the email, half of them are only spending less than 9 seconds. So you've got this stress of the pain of change. And then if you click into like what leaders are facing, it's like, well, should I use the carrot? Should I use the stick? Should I get them to come back in the office? Should I schedule more meetings? Like we need new tools. We need sort of a hybrid solution for this hybrid work. And I think we've sort of stumbled onto it.
Yeah, it's kind of an unbelievable statistic. I was not aware of that. That's on the email. That's crazy. To follow up on that, one thing that we've heard from a lot of the people that we work with, both business owners and colleagues and peers, that, again, getting back to sort of the return to work type of decision, they're struggling with mentorship, for lack of a better term, in terms of newer employees, people that are new to the company, that they really want to instill their culture of the company onto these new employees. But the fact that they maybe aren't getting as much face time because there's a hybrid work environment or a remote work environment, it's been a struggle. So I don't know if that's something that you've seen on your end or if you have any thoughts on that, but I can see that, particularly in my profession, the legal profession, I hear that all the time from attorneys that we work with is, now that they're still, a lot of them in a remote work environment, they don't get that one-to-one training or mentorship for the new associates coming out of law school, and them at least believing up front that might really hamper their growth as they move forward in their career. So I don't know, again, if you see that on your end or if you have any thoughts on that, but it'd be interesting to hear your take on that.
Mike, it's a great point. And I think this is for all of my, super progressive innovators who are like, oh, we just got to get everybody to work wherever they want, however they want, and just treat people like adults. I say, yes, and this is a great example of, if you've talked to people who've actually worked from home for longer than 10 years before the pandemic starts. I did this with a big space company that I was working with about 4 months ago. And I asked about 400 of their leaders, how many of you have actually worked from home for about a decade? And we had about 10% of the room stand up. And I said, great. Now answer honestly. Do the people that just started this exercise 2.5 years ago, since the pandemic started, since March 16, 2020, do they have any idea what they're doing yet? And they all just started laughing. Because I think the assumption was, well, I can just work from anywhere. And yes, there is definitely a lot of freedom within that framework. But I also think, you're hitting on a couple small pieces that are turning into big pieces. So number one, there were 5 generations in the workforce before the pandemic. Now you still have that notion, but now you have younger people that are missing what I would call the meeting after the meeting. So what is that? Well, it's like we meet, we're in a conference room, we're all hanging out. And then after the meeting ends, we all walk out together. Some of us walk to go get some coffee. Some of us walk to the parking lot to take a walk. Some of us are just walking back to our office. Those casual collisions, those conversations, that serendipity that we have essentially ripped out of the fabric of every organization, it is missing. It's missing in a big,
that's
big
interesting.
way.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's interesting.
And John and Mike, part of the issue with that is what leaders are doing is saying, all right, well, I'll schedule a fun Zoom meeting. I'll do a Zoom happy hour, or I'll do a Zoom yoga session. And look, we've run the play on all of these, both for ourselves and for other clients. And what I will say is, John, you're hitting on a really important piece, which is there's actually still a really important reason for us to gather. Think about it this way. What did they say in marketing? It would take 7 times before someone would know you or buy from you. But if you think about today, when we do this conversation now, if I were with you two right now in the same place, right, we were seeing each other's nonverbal cues, the signals, the subtle signs, right. Our EQ, our emotional intelligence would be at a heightened level. But now, because we want to keep the audio quality good, because we're doing this virtually or digitally, we're only listening to the sound of each other's voices. Now, it's not all bad. It's better than an email. But at the end of the day, it's sort of removing or stripping away the essence of how we collaborate, the essence of how we communicate. And look, I started this whole exercise with Shift 20 years ago because I had read Danny Goleman's book about emotional intelligence. And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is one of the core components of leadership. This was 20 years ago. Well, people mostly have heard about EQ, but my question is, do they know what digital emotional intelligence is? Do they understand that 70+% of people's days right now are between emails, instant messaging, and they're spending looking at a screen? So this is a new terrain. And I think in a lot of ways, organizations have undersold what it's going to take for them to learn how to collaborate better. And I think, last little point on this. So let's say you're removing serendipity. Well, the next, again, lever or tool for a leader to push is scheduled in person or scheduled Zoom meetings. Great. We've talked about it. Microsoft has a study that since the pandemic, 252% more meetings have been scheduled, which is why people are burned out. It's why people are saying they don't have time to go do their work because they're in back-to-back Zoom meetings. So what's the unlock? Well, the unlock for me is, how do we asynchronously collaborate? How do we get everyone on the same page without scheduling more meetings? Is that a muscle that most leaders have learned how to build? And I would say, going all the way back to your comment or your question, John, which is some of this has to be in person. Some of this doesn't have to be in person. Some of this has to be scheduled. Some of this has to be like emergence flow. It has to unfold like this conversation. Like we had a thought process, but who knows whether we're going to land at the exact place we thought we were.
Right.
That's not the way people talk. So if we don't want your team to feel like they're in a customer service like environment where you're talking to that telephone rep on the other side who's just doing their job, just doing the best they can. But let's be clear, they're reading from a script. They're reading from a playbook, and they're not really open to you going off script. Well, that's really what work has become. And it's why people have been so like disenfranchised. And in a lot of ways, they're not fired up. And so that's the way I would think about that, John.
You think it's affecting the younger people going back to the workforce? Obviously, there's a lot of people that are sitting on the sidelines for whatever reason. I don't know, but they are, because they're not. The younger people seem to be struggling. Are they staying home and doing their own thing with maybe Facebook? I mean, what are they doing? What do you see? I'm perplexed at what they're doing. I'm an old guy, so I'm an old guy that cut grass when I was 12 years old to get $10. But I don't understand why they're not motivated to go out and investigate the world around them, because it's a big world and they're missing it, I think.
Well, John, I think you represent a population, a generation where
be careful,
of the world. No, I know, brother. I know.
Be careful, Joe.
This is going to be a compliment.
Harry, I got to watch our gusts sometimes.
You represent a part of the population that I would say was moving out of survival to thrival, right? This was a generation that, can remember really hard moments in the world, in this country, in a very different way than I would say today are. And look, you're a dad. So what was the point of having kids and putting them out in the world is to have them a little bit better than you did, which means by default, John, even you, me, and even Mike, if we try to get really grateful for it, it's like we don't remember what a long, cold winter was when the Pilgrims got here. Like we're not going to remember what it was like to live through a civil war in your own country. Like these are things that we've graduated from. So therefore, there will be some version of entitlement. We didn't earn it. None of us did. We just got born here, right? And so if we just acknowledge and start there, I think what it does is it opens up the frame a little bit to say, okay, look, every older generation looks back at the younger generation and says, you guys are a little weaker. You're not quite as gritty or resilient. You had it a little less hard. And I go, yeah, all those things are true. And things are going to be a little harder for them in different ways, right? Just like it was harder for all of us in different ways than maybe our parents' generation. And so I think, the question that you're asking is like, what are they doing? I think it's a great question, because in some ways they've opted out of the system. They've opted out of this American dream of I'm going to go, work for someone like my dad for 46 years and all of the good things are going to happen. You know how rare it is that, my dad happens to work for a guy who gets it and my dad happens to get it. Like these are not common moments. Yeah. And go to this next place, which is, as you see the gig economy right now, they're saying that by 2027, about half the labor will be in some version of the gig economy, meaning not a full-time W-2 position. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. I think if you look at where AI is, maybe taking out some of the mundane roles, not as a replacement, but maybe as an augmentation of humans' production, I think that's one piece. And I think the second piece is you definitely have people that are making money doing things not cutting grass. Like they're making money online. They're making money through, different ways that may not seem like valuable. And by the way, some of them definitely don't feel like they're valuable to me. But I also think you've got people that are just looking for like, hey, my time's valuable. I'm just coming through a pandemic. I'm not going to do something unless it's really going to, in my mind, feel like it was worth it. And so I think that plus, you print $6 trillion and give it away. I mean, everybody's sort of on a little bit of money right now going, hey, so to me, it's like a lot of factors. And it's a great question. But I think in my mind, I'm like, okay, how do you think about just the talent in this country, the opportunity that exists for us to continue to be the most innovative country on the planet, the country that people send people to because, again, this is still the greatest example with a lot of flaws and a lot of things that are definitely not necessarily feeling like they're on track. But at the same time, it's still pretty much the best place to be, right? Yeah,
and that's the challenge. And that's the challenge you have with the generational conversation with our clients, because G1B, I think differently than G2, Michael. And then my grandkids are going to have a different mindset, education, relationship to the world around them. How do you communicate that generationally? We're challenged by that because we try to get everyone on the same page as a family, but often it's a challenge to do so because of that shift. And I guess your main point is you can't go backwards. So you got to go forward, but going forward, you got to figure it out because it's different. The technology is different. The community is different. And us older generations are struggling with, and I'm honest about it. I'm struggling with, how do I figure it out? Because Michael and I go back and forth. I go, Michael, pick up the phone and call Joe. Mike goes, Dad, I'm going to text him because he's busy. No, call Joe because that's a better way to communicate to Joe. No, Joe likes to be communicated by email. So we go back and forth, but he's right. I can't get anybody on the phone anymore. They don't pick up their phone.
It's up to the point now where I mean, I see on social media these memes all the time about like leaving a voicemail. It's like, oh, that's almost become obsolete. But you need to leave a voicemail somebody and just shoot them a text, or you can do an audio text now, right? I mean, somebody just sent one of those to me over the weekend. So it's just shifting, and some people I think like to be communicated to differently. I'm not totally against picking up the phone.
No, I'm teasing you. I'm making a point, but I pushed back at Michael in the past. I said, Michael, we're in a relationship business, and we need to have face-to-face contact, or at least voice contact with our clients. And he gets it. He agrees with me. But I'll give you another example real quick. We had a bunch of Zoom meetings with a new family that we work with on the West Coast. And it was 4 different families we're having a Zoom meeting with. It was the CPA firm. It was us. It was the family on a Zoom meeting. I was having a heart attack. It was like, okay, how's this going to flow? Well, we did 3 or 4 meetings like that because everyone was, it was hunkered down for COVID. And I get that. But our most impacted me when I said to the president of the company, we're flying out and we're going to spend a couple of days with you guys to go through all these processes. They said, great. It was significant impact on our relationship because we flew out. Made a huge difference to our relationship. And still today, we have that relationship. I love the face-to-face contact with these guys. But a lot of the newer folks in our business are not necessarily maybe looking at that. They're trying to find an easier way to connect. And I think, again, maybe to my fault, I'm not seeing how that's going to be successful. It's just how I'm looking at it.
Mm.
Well, maybe another way to think about it, John, is that there's the golden rule: treat others how you would want to be treated. Right. And then a good friend of mine, Jackie Insinger, wrote a book called Spark. And, she reminded me of, the so-called platinum rule, which is how people want to be treated is how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated on them. Right. And I think it does offer, a totally different set of alternatives because, Mike, as an example, I voice text all the time with people who I know like voice texting, right? I mean, if you call someone today out of the blue, as someone who's still hustling, right? We'll get into this maybe at some other point, but like, look, I'm still out there talking to CEOs as a business development and chief revenue officer for my company. I'll tell you, if you really want to see a strange response, just call somebody who's not expecting your phone call, who has kind of defaulted now to more digital communication. And, again, it's, I'm with you, John. Like, I would rather us be in person. I mean, 10 times out of, on Sunday. However, I think there's a few little minor unlocks with digital communication. I mean, 1, we didn't have to travel today. That's nice, right? 2, when we're on Zoom, there is a little interesting thing that happens in terms of hierarchy, which is, there's not the traditional, you guys, probably picked this up with me several times, which is I have been thinking about and studying power structures, power systems, blind spots with power. And, it's funny, when we're on a conference room, everybody's designed to look at the front of the room. There's a teacher, there's a leader in place. But on Zoom, we all have the same square. We all are arranged however that we got on the Zoom. And all of a sudden, the hierarchy sort of maybe unlocks a little bit. And I think that's interesting.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
And then I'll give you one last thing that makes me laugh about like digital communication is like, you guys have never been in my home, except for today, you're in my home. How crazy is that? Just from an intimacy standpoint, a personal connection standpoint, like that's pretty wild to think. Like back in the day, we would never thought of it this way, but now you're Zooming with people all over the world and you're literally in their homes. What gets more personal than that? So it's almost like if we somehow, some ways we widen the aperture, maybe we reframe some of these things. I think it's like, okay, we can default to phone sometimes. We can default to digital collaboration, and then maybe we can come up with a third or a fourth or a fifth option. So anyway, just some things to think about.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you talk about the number of meetings that have occurred since the pandemic. That I think was that Microsoft study that you mentioned. And I think that is becoming almost the reason for perhaps some of the burnout that we might be seeing, is because I'm just thinking in our business, even if it was a local, client, we'd still have to take, a half hour, 45 minutes to drive there. Usually you're not on a meeting, and obviously you need another 45 minutes on the way back after the meeting to get back to the office for the next meeting. You have these sort of natural breaks in your schedule, whereas now, it's Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting. It's almost as if we're almost trading off short-term efficiency for longer-term burnout potentially. I may be not articulating that properly, but that I like how you phrase that or put that in perspective.
You can't hide in today's world. You can't hide anywhere.
Right.
Everybody can track you down wherever.
Yeah.
Because of technology. I remember years ago, before iPhones and everything else, and I was using payphones when I was in the field. My boss didn't know where I was all day. I just had a report out of file. Here's what I did today. So today you can't hide. I guess that's not a bad thing, but it helps business, I guess, thrive more. But it's a fascinating change. Again, you got to go forward. You got to figure it out, to your point. And every industry is different, I guess, depending on what the industry is all about. And you have to figure it out. And I guess that's how you coach these companies. I'm assuming that's your master approach.
For sure. Look, I think at some level, it's hard to read the label on the jar you're in. And so I've said this from the very jump 22 years ago when we started working with organizations. Like, I don't know more than anyone else necessarily, but I'm not the one in it. So it's always easy to have a little bit of objectivity, as you're coming in. I mean, heck, we've hired over the last 22 years, no less than, a dozen plus consultants to help us in various sort of functions. And I think part of what you're saying too, John, is like, this is an opportunity to think through, like, look, yes, transparency sounds great. How do you think about transparency with your A players, not so much your C players? So the natural inclination is, well, now we're going to figure out what the heck those C players are doing. It's like, here we are again. We're focused our attention on the problem, not the people who potentially, look, the power curve says in most organizations, it's not 80-20, that, the 20% that are producing 80% of the results. It's typically 5% producing 90% of the results. Yeah. The question is, how are you focused on those folks? What kind of freedoms, do those folks need? The flexibilities do those folks need? Base your model off the A player, not the traditional C player that we always have a tendency to do.
Wow. Yeah, no, it's always about prioritization, right? Yep. No, I 100% agree. Listen, Joe, I think we're running a little low on time for this podcast, but you think you'd be up for part 2?
Let's do a part 2.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for this part 1, and I think we've got plenty to talk about for part 2, but thanks so much for being a part of this. Looking forward to it.
Joe, it was a pleasure.
You bet, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Definitely a pleasure, Joe. It's so good to meet you. I'm so glad you're part of the show. Gentlemen, thank you so much for bringing him on as a guest. And our last thank you, of course, goes to the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Truth About Wealth podcast with John and Michael Parise. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when John and Michael come out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. We humbly ask that you share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, as this actually does help others find the show. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Copper Beech Financial Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Truth About Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Copper Beech Financial Group. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.
This material is for informational purposes only. Neither APFS nor its representatives provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Please consult your own tax, legal, or accounting professional before making any decisions. Copper Beech is not affiliated with American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Securities offered through American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc., a member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisory and financial planning services offered through American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., an SEC-registered investment advisor. These opinions are subject to change at any time without notice. Any comments or postings are provided for informational purposes only and do not constitute an offer or a recommendation to buy or sell securities or other financial instruments. Readers should conduct their own review and exercise judgment prior to investing. Investments are not guaranteed, involve risk, and may result in a loss of principal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. Investments are not suitable for all types of investors. Copper Beech is an unaffiliated entity of American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Any opinion expressed in this forum is not the opinions of American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., and have not been reviewed by the firm for completeness or accuracy. American Portfolios and Copper Beech Financial Group are not affiliated with any other named business entities mentioned. American Portfolios, Copper Beech, and Shift are unaffiliated entities.